most of you are aware of Autistica, but for those of you who are less familiar with us, Autistica is the UK's autism research charity. And our vision is a world where all autistic people and their family members can live a long, healthy, happy life. And so we do that by funding autism research, but really ultimately we do that by trying to think strategically about how research can deliver change. And so we're very much seen as quite a strategic funder, and really proud to have much of the research that we've funded on show today, which we think is exceptionally innovative, and things like citizen science, which are really rethinking how we do autism research itself. We're also this year not just trying to be a funder of autism research, but someone who can work with researchers, autistic people, family members, and other stakeholders to get autism research funded. And so now we're increasingly partnering on different research grants as well. And so if you have a research idea and you think Autistica can help deliver impact, be that by involvement or through doing things like policy, very much get in touch with us, because we'd be delighted to work with you. A key thing with that Autistica is really proud to do is to host this conference. We think that getting brilliant people from a range of different backgrounds in one room is really ultimately key to achieving that progress and achieving our vision of long, healthy, happy lives for autistic people, because we need to deliver that change. It's a change that we desperately need to see. And that's why we're delighted to be in Reading to host what is now our second ever Discover conference. I asked the team for facts about Reading, and they didn't really come up trumps, if I'm honest with you. The best thing I got was that there are 5 different potatoes named after Reading. So, thanks, team. But perhaps more excitingly, it's the home of some really fantastic autism research, and we're really delighted to be hosted today by Bhismadev and Teresa, 2 leading researchers in the field of autism. And of course, we're really proud to have been able to support Teresa throughout her career. First of all, in terms of doing a PhD studentship, looking at central processing, up until now, where we're co-funding a fellowship with MQ looking at anxiety and central processing to support Teresa. I also need to thank them, of course, for their amazing support in hosting this event and putting this on. It takes a lot of goodwill to do this and a lot of hard work to get to where we are today. So thank you so much to them for that. I also can pass this section without saying thank you to our amazing Discover coordinator, Bethan. I'm sure you have all heard from Bethan. Bethan joined us last year, and her expertise and knowledge and just skill set in terms of events is just truly phenomenal, and she's made this just really seamless for us, and so massive thank you to her. Fujitsu are our first ever main sponsor of a Discover conference, and I just want to say an enormous thanks to them. It's thanks to them that we're able to offer tickets at such a low price, but also it's thanks to them that we're able to stream this event for free today, which we're really, really proud to do. We want to make this conference as accessible as we can. Of course, this is our second ever conference, so we're not going to get everything right. And we really would love to hear your feedback. And please help us and be patient with us as we try to get things right. And that will help us to ensure that in 2020, this event will be even better. And I'm excited to say that the event next year looks like it's going to be in Nottingham. So we're another tribute to Bethan's organisation that we already know where it's going to be next year. More than anything today, I'd just like you all to be kind to each other. You're all brilliant people. Everyone has different knowledge and expertise to bring, and no person alone can achieve the change that we need to see in the world. And that's why it's really important that we allow room for this nuanced type of discussion and the discussion of ideas. Now, at a research conference, you're going to hear things you agree with, and you're going to hear things that you disagree with. The point is to try and have those debates calmly and compassionately. So I'm sure you've all read our code of conduct around that. So just, please be kind to each other. But ultimately, thank you for coming. We're delighted. Delighted to be here, and let's enjoy today, and I'm really looking forward to the ideas that you all have and that you're here to share. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you all very much, and hand over to Bhishma. Perfect. Great. Oh, I just remembered one last thing. I just forgot about flapapplause. So the other accommodation that we make at this conference is that we use flapplause, which is that instead of clapping, we use our hands to show appreciation for things. So for those of you that are familiar with that, that involves doing this rather than clapping. So if you could just make that accommodation, that would make life a lot easier for many of our delegates. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. My name is Bhishma Chakrabarti. I'm a professor here at the University of Reading and the research director of the Center for Autism here. We are particularly delighted to host this wonderful conference here, and it is a real honor for us, thanks to Autistica, to be chosen as the host for this meeting, which is definitely the premier autism research meeting in the UK. And special thanks to Autistica also for doing all the heavy lifting of organization. So this has been one of the most wonderful experiences of being conference chairs, being just involved only in the intellectual side of things mostly. So special thanks to Bethan and the entire team of Autistica. And just to move beyond the Reading potatoes, we have to talk a little bit about the history. And initially, I will admit, when I first moved here, I thought, well, we are the group that we have here, and I'll mention them briefly. We are setting up, or we are the initial autism researchers at Reading, and then soon I was put out of my illusion. And I realized that Reading has a tradition of doing somewhat unsung autism research. So if we go back to the late 1960s, early 70s, when psychoanalysis is the ruling paradigm for autism, Corinne Hutt in Reading was doing psychophysiology of anxiety symptoms in autism. So measuring skin conductance and anxiety in autistic children in late 60s, early 70s. This is by far kind of at that point very much unfashionable research. And now, of course, this is all very accepted. And then again, if you cut to late 1970s, John Richer and Richard Koss they have a series of papers on gaze avoidance and social approach avoidance behaviors in autism, which of course is now very fashionable in light of social motivation and all that we know about that side of the story. But again, I did not know about them myself, so I would be very surprised that if how many people actually know about that 1970s literature by John Richer and others. And again, carrying on with the unfashionable thread, in the mid-2000s, Glenn Gibson's group here in Reading did one of the first proper systematic gut microbiology study of autism. I mean, this is, at that point, you wouldn't really embark on a microbiological study of autism. This is post-Wakefield already. So so I think that way there has been this thread of autism research that has been going through the University of Reading, and I'm very proud to be part of that thread right now. Fiona Knott and Tom Lucas are the clinical directors of the center. So our center here has a clinical arm which does interventions and diagnostic assessments. And the research arm currently consists of Teresa's work, which you have already heard, which is sensory symptoms and mental health. My own work is on social cognitive phenotype and also use of digital health technologies. And Dr. Fang Liu's work is on language and music in autism. And so as such, we cover a whole different, a diverse spectrum of topics within the autistic phenotype in the Center for Autism, both from a clinical as well as a fundamental research perspective. And so it's particularly again, it's a particular honor for us to host this meeting, which again showcases a diversity of approaches and topics in autism research. And I will hand over to Dr. Tavassoli to welcome you to the conference, and then we can begin with the order of events.
Also, yeah, a big welcome from me. Thank you all for being here. We're very excited. And again, a big thank you also to Beth and Autistica for making this day possible. And today is really, there are many very timely topics and also a broad range of themes. And all of these topics were actually selected together with the community, which James already mentioned is really very crucial, I think, and I think the UK is really pioneering this as well, to have a participatory framework and highlighting the importance of conducting research with the autistic community. And you've seen that already. It started throughout the breakfast workshops, and throughout the day you will hear more about this. And in addition to more traditional talks, I'm also excited to say that in the afternoon we have two sessions, the IdeaSec and the technology session, which are slightly different. And the IdeaSec in particular, I think, is intriguing because we will hear about new ideas. So these are potential studies that have not been conducted yet. And there will also be a chance to talk to whoever presented the idea afterwards to discuss it a bit further. And we also have a technology session, which is really highlighting that this is an emerging theme in the field, the use of technology. And I think we still have to, there's a long way to go, but it's still interesting to debate this. And talking about technology, I was hoping we are there yet that you can just duplicate yourself and you can be at several sessions at the same time, because I really had difficulties to say, oh, where do you have to be? I mean, I'm chairing, so I know where I have to be. But still, it's but there is also, by the way, it will all be live streamed, and there is, I think, in 1 or 2 weeks, everything will be recorded, so you can see it after. So don't worry too much if you miss out today on one session. And yeah, I think it will be really a thought-provoking day. And at this stage, I would actually like to introduce our first keynote speaker, Jonathan Green. Who will be talking about autism interventions throughout development. And Professor Jonathan Green is a professor of child and adolescent psychiatry at the University of Manchester, and also an honorary consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist as well. And really what I think Jonathan potentially is most well known is the pioneering work in parent-mediated interventions using video feedback, and has done some fantastic work also using randomized clinical trials and showing positive effects. And I'm very excited to hear more about the research. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I also forgot something. It's like, not going to copy you. So we will have, the talks will be 30 minutes long. And then you have 10 minutes after each talk to ask questions. So I'm sure there will be many questions and thoughts, but it would be great if you, so 30 minutes and then 10 minutes questions. Great.
Thank you, Teresa. So it's a real pleasure to be opening this conference, and I'm grateful to James and Autistica for inviting me to have the chance to speak to you. What I chose to do this morning is to do quite a sort of conceptual talk, really. So it's intended to be quite a broad brush, conceptual, thought type talk with you to share some thoughts about how we may think about organising intervention for autism through development. So that's my title. There's going to be some data, but not very much, and so I hope that this is more of a sort of conceptual, thought-provoking. It'll be interesting to share this and have discussion with you. So, we don't need to emphasize this in this audience with us together, but I have a reason just for focusing on some particular things here, if you bear with me. So we know that ASD, autism spectrum conditions are quite prevalent across the world where they've been studied. The characteristic of them that I want to focus on with you is their developmental nature, arising early in development and enduring often throughout the life course, and the impact of the condition overall. Of course, we know what a heterogeneous group of experiences, conditions are covered by these terms. So, when we talk about this, you'll understand, I know, that this is a generalization across many different kinds of conditions and experiences. But nevertheless, taken as a whole, and I think it's important for me at least to kind of keep this in mind, this kind of development does have big impacts on individuals and a community. And one way of thinking about that and measuring it is cost. This is, of course, not to say this is the be-all and end-all, but it's just one way of marking the impact on development, however that comes about. And these are the sorts of numbers that you come up with when health economists look at what they call the lifetime individual social societal costs of autistic spectrum conditions through the life course. So lifetime individual costs of around about £1.5 million per an individual. And for the country, for the UK, we're talking over £30 billion annually. And people are often surprised to find that this cost, put like this, is more than stroke, hypertension and cancer put together. So we're talking about, in the context of healthcare and organisation of health services, a pretty significant thing. And that's really what I want to emphasise to you. And when I talk, and others of us talk to commissioners and others, we need to say this. Why is it? Where do these costs come from? And there's a bit of evidence for that. We don't have it all broken down very, very neatly, but for under 16s, a lot of it has to do with the needs for special and residential education. And for adults, it has to do with the need for supported accommodation and the opportunity costs of productivity losses in the workplace. What underlies all of that, I think I'm going to suggest to you, has to do with social integration, valency, and independence. That actually is a lot of what drives a lot of these costs. Because as soon as we have people in our community who need that level of support in some way, the costs immediately escalate. So I want to focus on those social aspects. What is our current clinical response to that situation? Well, what I'm going to suggest to you, and for those of you who are interested in reading more about this, myself and a colleague wrote a paper last year in Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry called The State of Autism Intervention Science, where I tried to set this out. And basically what I wanted to say there was that there is a lot to be asked for in terms of intervention responses. We're nowhere near what we want to be. The intervention response we currently have across our community is often reactive in quality. In other words, services wait for problems, crises, or whatever to arise, in particularly CAMS. Because of that, it's often late in development. So children will come into services for support and therapy quite late, often in the school years. It's often poorly evidenced. People are sometimes surprised about this, but it's the case. There's really not a good enough body of evidence yet for intervention. And it's kind of ad hoc. There's postcode lottery, it's this and that, what people are used to doing, etc. We don't have a systematized plan for how we respond. So what I'm going to argue for you today and share with you is the fact that I think we need a rethink of all that we've got sufficient evidence now emerging to say that we can actually mount something that's efficient, evidenced, prospective. That means it starts early and it continues, and it's developmentally pulsed. And what I mean by that is that this isn't about endless intervention the whole time. It's about being strategic, targeted, and intelligent about what we do with families and young people. And let me emphasize that what I'm going to be talking about is early development. So Brian is going to, after me, is going to talk about adults. This is really childhood and adolescence that I'm particularly thinking about here. And we need interventions that impact development. There's no point having interventions that have very short-term effects, and we don't know if they really do anything. This is a developmental condition, and if we're really going to be useful, it's got to be an impact on development that we're really looking for. So that's a big challenge for us, big threshold. The other thing about autism I've emphasized is its enduring condition. And so what I've done, and partly the presentation's based on, is thinking about what do we know from other enduring conditions in healthcare and other research and thinking that's been done about that might help us organize our intervention in a more systematic, rational way. So that's what I'm going to try and present to you, models from other healthcare. So here is my distillation of the relevant models that I think we have from other kinds of enduring illness research around the world. And there has been a fair amount, usually in chronic physical conditions, but some long-standing emotional and psychological difficulties as well. First message, that self-management, so-called, and obviously we're talking about sort of adult-orientated here, but patients, users, people affected looking after themselves is a core primary necessary component of quality long-term care. There have been a lot of studies. You'll see here, this is an HTA summary report by Taylor et al. Over 1,500 studies on this. What's important to say here is this is not about saying to people, okay, just get on with it. Self-management is a complex intervention in itself. It needs education, it needs psychological and system support to make it happen properly. And I'm going to be trying to emphasize with you how I think that can happen for us. And the way I'm going to be suggesting in early development that we do this is that we talk about supporting family resilience as our primary goal in terms of autism development. The second take-home from the enduring illness research for me is the importance of case management. That is, having a worker who is sustained, close, available to the patient, the user, the family, and can be responsive to them and can help them every day. There's been work on this in chronic mood disorder in adults, so-called collaborative care model, where this case management was shown to be more effective than other kinds of organisation of care. And I'm going to be suggesting, although this is challenging actually to introduce this, that this is something we ought to be doing. The third take-home is stepped care. And Pete Bauer from Manchester has written a lot about this. It's quite an interesting concept. And basically this is about having what's called step-up access to more specialist, expensive intervention when that's needed and only when it's needed and only for as long as it's needed. And then importantly to have step-down care afterwards, because otherwise you just end up with endless step-up care. The step-down should be to a sustaining intervention that is of lower intensity but not lower effectiveness. In other words, this is not dumbing down care. This is not second rate. This is actually first rate and targeted. And I'm going to be talking about how step care is appropriate for our work. So I'm using these concepts to try and help us, or help me and share with you, think about how we might organize a model based on autism as a developmental and enduring condition. So here's the structure of it. In a developmental sequence, we have the prodromal period, which is the first few years before diagnosis, which can be a variable time, of course, as we know. We have the diagnostic period, and the adjustment of the individual and the family to that diagnosis and everything that goes along with that. Then we have what happens after diagnosis, and I'm going to be suggesting the focus on core symptoms, i.e. the defining characteristics of ASD as a condition, on the one hand, and what I'm calling comorbidities, which are associated difficulties on the other. And then, of course, there are stuff happens, life happens, and there are transitions, and it's how all those are kind of managed, and then the big transition, in a sense, into adulthood at the end of that time. So this is my developmental sequence, and I want to think about how, and this is what all children, young people who grow with an autism trajectory go through this sequence. And so I'm suggesting how we might respond to that. So let's start with the prodrome, the possibilities of what we call preemptive intervention. That is an intervention that distinguishes young children who are at risk for whatever reason of possibly developing autism, to see if something can be put in place pre-diagnosis that could help their development, and prepare for the prepare resilience. So there's a whole group of preemptive intervention strategies that we can think about. There's peri-diagnostic support, i.e. how do we look after families and individuals around diagnosis, post-diagnostic intervention, specific disorder treatments for what I'm calling comorbidities, and then how to manage transitions throughout development. As it was introduced, a lot of the work I've done with colleagues has been on parent-mediated interventions. This is with the parents as the prime and the family as the prime target of early intervention. These are interventions delivered with parents primarily, but the focus is on helping the family's adaptation and resilience and the child's development. So the theory behind it is that you work with the parent at the top, with the therapist. That changes how the parent is with the child in predictable ways, based on our theory about development. And that change itself then will feed out and generalize into improved child functioning in the wider world beyond the family. And of course, this is how all kids of whatever developmental kind develop sociability and social interaction. They do it through this process of experiencing social life in their intimate environment of the family early on, and then generalizing it out into the wider world. And what we say in this kind of work is that children with autism are no different to that. They should be thought about in that same developmental frame. There are advantages of doing this in terms of its working in the natural environment of the family. Working like this does not imply that the parents of children with autism have any difficulties, particularly, or there's any sense that this is a parental problem. This is really working with parents, using them alongside us to deliver, if you like, the therapeutic input to the child. So we work with therapists almost as co-therapists, not really co-therapists, but it's with them. This has the spin-off of helping parental empowerment, confidence, and family functioning. That's what we hope for. And that's going to be relevant to what I say. It also has a spin-off of being pretty efficient in professional time, because we don't need to put so much expensive professional time into it. And if it works, then there's a 24/7 therapeutic effect on the child, because the child is exposed to this every day. And in the work that we've done with colleagues, some of whom are here, we work with the parents using video feedback, as was mentioned, to make those changes in interaction, to see how they could cascade downstream. So it's that chain of effect we're looking for. And I want to just briefly mention 2 bits of work that I've done with colleagues at 2 different stages of the autism journey. And the first is in this prodromal period, and this is what we call our iBasis project, which is a preemptive intervention. What we're actually doing here, I think, is strengthening developmental competencies, social abilities. That's what we're aiming to do. This is a controversial area, of course, if people start thinking about, well, are you trying to prevent autism happening? And really, that's not really the way we think about it. This is more about strengthening vulnerable children in development from the get-go with their families. And this iBasis intervention is a 5-month intervention based in the home, working with the parents on various sequenced developmental targets and topics with their child, and adjusting this to whether there are any developmental difficulties that may emerge. But of course, in these babies who in our study here were at risk because they were siblings of children who already had autism. So this is the so-called sibling risk, so it's a familial risk. Most of these children weren't actually, as it quotes, symptomatic. This is before they developed the autistic syndrome. So we've published this work in one particular RCT in the UK, and obviously the details are there if you'd like to look at them. It's a RCT of 54 infants, 9 to 14 months, so this is done within the first year. Haven't got time, not going to go into the details of the results of the therapy, but I just wanted to indicate this as one kind of take-home from this work. If you look across the x-axis along the bottom, that's months from the start of therapy. So the therapy started at 9 months. Going up is the difference between the groups, the group who received this intervention and the group who didn't. And it's the way that the chart is done is that the group who didn't receive any intervention is constrained to be 0. That's why it's a dotted line across horizontally. And the iBasis group are in a continuous line. This is using the AOC and the ADOS, that are 2 standardized measures of autistic pre-symptoms. And what you see, the take-home I want you to see here is that we have reduced the severity of the autism symptoms. Here is the end of the therapy. The vertical dotted line is the end of the therapy. And then you've got 2 years after that. So what we're suggesting here, although the differences are not massive, and you'll see the confidence intervals at any particular time point cross each other, so that this is, at each time point, it's not technically a significant effect, could be by chance, but when you take it all together and the area between these curves, it turns out that the cumulative effect over time is highly significant. In other words, there is an impact on the social symptom development over time that seems to be sustained after the end of therapy. So that's and there have been other work that's been done on this, some with some positive effects, some with not positive effects, and I'll come back to the overall evidence for this a little later. But this is an example of what could be done. It raises lots of issues around how you identify children at risk and whether you'd want to do this, whether it's worth doing, but it's there as a possibility. I'll come back to the overview after. Then moving on to the diagnostic period, a lot of services, as we all know, provide post-diagnosis support, workshops, psychoeducation, that kind of thing, in more or less organized ways. There is, however, until now, very little actual evidence of what these do and whether they're helpful. So it's pretty much an evidence-free zone. There is a bit of work using acceptance and commitment therapy, so-called ACT, and this is preliminary work thinking about how working with parents, particularly this, because these are young children, usually preschool or early school, to help them adjust, that may be a helpful component. And in Manchester, we are currently doing quite a large trial of a peri-diagnosis workshop model like this that combines psychoeducation and ACT therapy, and we'll see if this actually helps. This will be really the first decently sized, the first RCT at all, I think, of a peri-diagnostic intervention like this. So we'll see in a few years how that works. Then we come on in the developmental sequence to core symptoms. So after diagnosis, what I'm suggesting here is that we have now the evidence-based capability to intervene with children early after diagnosis in a prospective way. In other words, we don't wait to find out what problems arise later. We actually can offer something with the target of helping social development or early symptomatic development of these children and family resilience. Those are the targets of the therapy. And the particular work that we've done along these lines is the so-called PACT therapy, preschool autism communication therapy, which we've worked on for a number of years now. And this is rather like the iBasis. It's a longer therapy, so 6 to 12 months, but it has the same basic structure. The therapist works with the parent to understand their child's communication, adjust to it in a more synchronous type way, and then we hope that will then have a cascading effect on the child's experience of social interaction and their capacity to generalize social skill and competency, as it were. So we've published this kind of work in a large trial that we then followed up, and there have been various other trials of work like this, both of this kind of model, and also there are other models that I'll mention later in the States that do a similar kind of thing. And we've also adapted this for work in India as well, India and Pakistan. And basically what this work shows, again, I'm not going to go into the detail of the results, but this is just to give you a flavour of it, is that the chart is set up in the same as the last slide I showed you. You've got the endpoint of therapy, as you can see there, and then you've got, in this case, a 6-year follow-up. So we intervened preschool, and then we followed the children up when they were about 10 and a half average age, so about 6 years later. And this is the ADOS, which is the sort of standard measure of autism symptom severity. And what you'll see here in the red line is the PAC group, and you'll see that at endpoint we were able to reduce the severity of the symptomatic presentation of the children significantly through the kind of work I was talking about. And the important thing, in a sense, as well as that, is that when we followed the children up 6 years later, we seem to get a sustained effect. So this is about 6 years after the end of therapy. And that does suggest to us, this kind of exact finding hasn't been replicated yet, but at least in this study, which was 152 children, it suggested to us that what we were doing preschool was having a sustained effect on development, which is in a way what we want to see from an intervention, I think. So if you put these two together, the prodromal intervention at the bottom and the PACT intervention at the top, you'll see they look remarkably similar outcomes, which is a really interesting thing. So the intervention prodromally and the intervention preschool seem to look rather similar in their developmental impact. So my message from this to share with you is that I think we do have interventions now that can actually have an impact on development when they're introduced soon after diagnosis. And I think this is important to kind of emphasize, because there has been a move away from thinking about the core autism development, if you like, as an object of therapy. And I'm well aware of the controversies around this, which is part of the reason why perhaps the attention has gone away from it a bit, and we can talk about this in discussion. I think we have a method here of intervening to both support families, help family resilience, and improve child development competencies. And to me, this is the way that we can improve self-management. So if we're going to help the generality of families in some way or other, that's where the kids are growing up early on, and this is what we need to help. So this is my suggestion for our self-management type strategy. Then, of course, life moves on. Children move out of the family into the world of school and the social environment, and it's challenging often. And we know that a lot of children with autism are more vulnerable than their peers to develop a number of different kinds of difficulties, of adjustment, of just managing life, complexity, sleep, feeding, concerning behaviors, anxiety, depression. All of these things are more likely than the neurotypical kids to be developing. So these things do happen, tend to be a bit later, so in the early and middle school years, in adolescence. And we need to respond to those. And my argument here is this is where the step-up care happens. So if we've got the primary family-focused treatment for family resilience, then we also have in the background a step-up care to manage these more difficult things that may often arise. They can be of various kinds. I'm not going to go into huge detail for time, but one thing to say from my point of view as a clinician is that a lot of what we see can be understood in relation to notions of transaction in development. In other words, if we understand autism as an aspect of neurodiversity, that children with autism have particular experiences of life, and they aren't always understood by the world around them very well at all. And this is what Damien Milton's called the double empathy problem, so that they may find it difficult to understand the social world, but the social world, if you like, has difficulty understanding them. And this kind of transactional difficulty is actually the origin of a lot of the emerging difficulties that we see in our kids growing. And we need to understand it like that, because that will inform how we intervene. The intervention may need to be with the environment to change it, to make it more adapted to the autistic child. It may be a combination of different kinds of work, focuses that need to happen. But these emerging difficulties are often complex. They do often need some specialist reflection to really work them out, so that therapy services don't hair off down the wrong line and make things worse. So I want to emphasize complexity and adjustment. This is just people with experience can work with the families on these issues. And of course, a lot of it has to do with school. Then we have a number of more sort of defined comorbidities, so-called, and these are all well known to be common in children with autism. How do we manage these? Well, what I'm suggesting is that this is an aspect of the step-up care model. So we have specialist services that should be good at this stuff. We've still got a long way to go to work out the best ways of managing these kinds of problems in our autistic children. The NICE guidance suggests that you should use the equivalent treatment for each of these different conditions, disorders, as they are in the neurotypical, if you like, population, to put it sort of simply. So there are a range of treatments for anxiety, ADHD, etc. And they should be used, suitably adapted. The problem with that, of course, is that life's much more interesting and complicated than that. That anxiety in an autistic development isn't like anxiety often in a neurotypical development. And we need much more basic research basic clinical focus on actually trying to understand all that. And it's beginning. That's beginning. But we won't get really good treatments for these co-occurring conditions until we have that basic science to really understand how these things emerge. And that really goes for all these comorbidities, in my view. So we do have some evidence-based treatments, however, that we can use. So for concerning behaviors in autistic children, there is at least one decent RCT that suggests that an individually based social learning model is quite helpful in helping those conditions, but there's a lot more to managing these kind of things than that. It's about understanding where those behaviors sort of come from, and that goes beyond my remit today. We have other specific therapies for these different disorders, which I won't need to go through with you. But my point is that we have some treatments available. It's just that they're not well adapted to the autistic condition yet, and that's work to be done. So, my summary. We are thinking about autism as a developmentally emergent and enduring condition, and how we think about a treatment model. And this is what I'm proposing. The different shades of blue in the boxes around therapies kind of indicate the different level of evidence that we've got at the moment. So the evidence is patchy. We don't have very much for the prodromal preemptive interventions. We don't have anything at all for the psychoed, really, a little bit. We have a bit more for these what's called social communication interventions. So there's the PAC model I talked about. There's a model called Jasper in the US, which also works a bit similar and has got pretty good information, evidence. There are more behavioral models that you'll be familiar with, like ESDM, which have some more equivocal evidence, I would say. But we have a bit more evidence, and it's reviewed in the paper that I wrote last year. For specific disorder treatments, yeah, we've got a bit of evidence, but it's inadequate at the moment. And then binding it all together, I'm suggesting that it would be great to have case management to give the families an anchor, as it were, going through. This is much easier said than done. It's a great aspiration, but it's actually difficult to get the right level of person to do this, that the families will have confidence in, and to keep that person for long enough. This is, I think this is it's a difficult managerial thing, but families really value this, of course, when they have it, as a signposting, as a hand-holding, if you want, or a support, and then directing access into step-up care. So a lot of the transitions that are problematic for autistic children and families are predictable. We know often when they happen, and case management can deal with that. If we're going to implement something like this, and as I say, we've got at least emerging evidence for most of these elements, it'll need a rethink of how we deliver autism care in the community and organise services. And when I've talked about this before with colleagues, you know, well, we'll see what you guys think. But when I've talked about this before, people say, yeah, whoa, you know. But in theory, yes, what about practice? But, you know, I'm sorry, I think it's worth it. That's the point. I think it's worth it, and I think we need the resource to do something like this, because we need to have an intervention at each level. And of course, what we hope is that if we can intervene like this, the effects will be additive. So we start early. It's not a panacea to start early, but it sets things off on the right course, and we hope that the pulsed interventions afterwards will be additive. So that's my proposal to you. It'll be interesting to see what you think about it. And just my thanks to my colleagues who've worked with me on the prodromal study and on the PAC team across the England. So many thanks. I think I don't know how I did for time, but have I got time for questions?
7 minutes.
Okay, that's pretty good.
Yeah, so we have just under 10 minutes now for some questions.
You want it? Well, Okay. At the back, red the at the back, yeah. Yeah, you, yeah.
Very much. I did miss the beginning, so I hope that I won't have. I hope my question won't be have been answered before. But I'm a clinician and I'm a parent of a child on the spectrum as well, and I think this is great. But for me, school is a real problem, and actually generalisation is a real problem. And I really have been trying to work on changing the way of viewing neurodiversity in schools and nurseries so that they're on board with this from the beginning, because often when the care is in isolated little sort of pockets like that and the therapy is, of course the families need help, but I think you almost get stuck if you can't go wider than that. Certainly that's what I found. And I don't know, I wondered where you saw school and nursery and how to actually, because every social situation is a difficulty for these kids. It's everywhere, isn't it? And so
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to this, but for me, certainly, I'm always thinking about how to involve more
thank
people
you.
than that.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I mean, it's an omission from the talk. And so, of course, the education environment right from the get-go at nursery right through is absolutely key. And we have, one thing we're working on at the moment is we have done an adaptation of the PACT treatment into schools. So we are basically training, working with the TAs, the therapy teaching assistants in the schools to do the same work. And so the model in the current study we're doing is the kids get, when they're in school, they get that work with the TA, and then in parallel at home, they get the same work with the parents. So it's like a double dose in both environments. And what we're looking to see is whether that will actually make a difference. I mean, I think one issue is whether the schools are going to be receptive to this kind of work. And our experience is a bit mixed. So some love it, and some, have, perfectly reasonably their own ways of going at things. But I totally agree with you. The school environment is obviously a key thing. But in a way, that has to be balanced with supporting families too. So it's like neither should be.
I like the transactional nature of a lot of, from beginning right the way through, obviously. What I have issue with is outcome measures, things like ADOS, and what it is we're measuring and what's considered optimal in development, and I call that into question. And I think with what's actually being impacted upon with communication and transactional stuff, that's good. But if you think of restrictive behaviour and interests, an intervention there could increase stress or reduce stress depending on which behaviour you're looking at. So I think there's more work on what it is we're actually intervening with and why, and what your comment is on that.
Well, no, I mean, totally, that's totally true. That in a way would be a whole different talk. And so I do appreciate you bringing it up, Damien, but it's like, yeah, we could talk about that. I think that our focus on what we call the autism symptoms, i.e. the defining characteristics that are kind of measured in the ADOS, include both social communication and restrictive repetitive behaviours. And both of those aspects actually are improved by the PACT therapy, which is slightly counterintuitive in some ways, but actually that is the fact of it, it is. And we have a model to kind of explain why we think that the behavioural, restrictive, repetitive behaviours are actually improved by a social communication type intervention. We could, go into that. But I think the issue of, well, what should intervention be doing? What's going to be useful? Of course, is a key question. And it's like a whole different talk discussion. And so I just want to acknowledge it. I mean, we don't have time to talk about it. We have chosen to look at the symptom. It's not all we looked at in the pack, in the work we've done. We've looked at lots of other outcome measures, but we do think that's important. I think that's an important thing to look at. But yeah, it's a whole big question. One more.
One more question.
Yeah. Jörg Mol, Oxford Health. I'm an autistic adult. You started this discussion with a number of how much money society on average spends on autistic people like us. Frightened me, but also I realize it's necessary. At the end of your talk, you said, I think it's worth it. What argument would you make to those who think we're not worth it?
Wow.
I mean, this can't be a new question, surely.
Goodness, I don't know. How long do you want? Well, I think, I'm speechless. I mean, of course you're worth it. Anyone who, the one thing to say is that, as I recognized at the beginning, there's a huge diversity of individual experience, people, capability that are, captured in this big umbrella, which has to be recognized. And people are worth it in different ways. But
on a purely financial level, how would we be able to give back and rather than be a drain on society?
Well,
something else?
okay, so I understand your question better. So it's a very important point. So when I don't see this as a drain. I don't think that's. I understand the way you've construed the number, and I appreciate that. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. And I could send you the basic literature behind this, and from the health economists, and they don't see this as a drain. This is a mixture of costs that any compassionate and intelligent, compassionate society should put in to look after its citizens. Right? So a lot of it is that. It's nothing to do with the drain. It's actually appropriate costs that should go in and do go in. There are other kinds of costs that may be able to be mitigated. In other words, there may be things like residential care, which is hugely expensive. So if we could prevent kids needing to be in residential care, as an example, we'd be saving a lot of money, which would be useful. So these costs I put up are a mixture. Some of it is just totally appropriate. We spend stuff on stuff that are important and people are important. Some of them may be able to be mitigated, and that could be the basis of a health economic argument for this kind of thing. But in the end, I don't see it as a primary health economic argument. Primarily, it's about the right thing to do for our community and people in our community.
I was just going to, very briefly, I think the real way to see that number is really as a societal failure, which is a failure to really accommodate, to meet the needs of autistic people and to really ensure that they're thriving in society. And I know the National Autistic Society, Tim's here, have done a lot of work really showing that if society invested, they would really make the best of their society in terms of looking after autistic people and ensuring that they meet their potential in life. And so I think the point here is it's a missed opportunity to really ensure that everyone thrives in society.